Welcome to the Power to the Patients podcast, where we cut through the noise to bring real-world insights on modern drug development and the science that drives breakthrough therapies. I'm Brandon Lee, co-founder of Power. My guest today is Sacha Schermerhorn, founder and CEO of Babylon Bio, whose work in Alzheimer's research became personal after his grandmother's diagnosis. We talked about why the field may be targeting the wrong pathology, his burning house analogy, and how Babylon Bio is using AI to predict clinical trial success.
If you're going into a burning house and you're trying to put out the fire, you're not going after the match that started the fire, right? It's irrelevant at that point. You're going for the actual fire itself.
Welcome to Power to the Patients. I'm your host, Brandon Lee, and today I'm joined by Sacha Schermerhorn, founder CEO of Babylon Bio. Sacha, welcome to the show. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Thanks, Brandon. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Maybe just as a precursor, what is Babylon Bio and how did this come about?
So Babylon's a small molecule therapeutics company focused on Alzheimer's. This is a disease I have cared about for a very long period of time. I started doing research. I was 15, I guess, when I started. I'm now 29. So been caring about this disease for a long time. It started off on the scientific side and then actually coincided with the diagnosis of my grandmother. And so I think just, the kind of parallel track of like being on the research side, being very invigorated by a lot of the stuff we were seeing in the lab. And then that incongruity with, unfortunately, what happened to my grandmother. This was like, very kind of like sobering discordance that, got me very passionate about starting a company here.
Yeah. Look, Alzheimer's is a thoroughly researched field. I'm curious, what did you see that convinced you that there was something different to do?
I think a lot of it just started with actually talking to a lot of the top KOLs who were very jealous of my time. Like when I started Babylon 3 years ago, it was a lot of it was just like the first year. So I technically incorporated in October of 22. And the first year was literally just me sending hundreds and hundreds of cold emails. I probably met with 500 plus researchers in the Alzheimer's space in the first year. And people were very generous with their time and also honest about the lack of knowledge that we had as collectively as a field. I felt pretty invigorated by that. And I'd say a lot of the confidence just came from understanding that there were fundamental pillars of this disease we still hadn't understood. That for me generally has just been an invigorating concept. And I think the reality is like no one has answers here. And we've learned a lot as a field. And I think there's just opportunity to rewrite that playbook.
Yeah. And kind of like digging in a little bit to the Babylon story, I know that you've got a slightly unique way of approaching it. I know you can't get into too much into details, but like at the highest level, like what is the thesis for how Babylon wants to approach this?
I mean, look, I think, if your North Star is to develop a treatment for Alzheimer's, you have to get creative around financing that and amortizing the risk of any individual program. I think there's it is very hard as a company for your entire existence to be predicated on a single asset. And so to whatever extent you can mitigate the risk of being beholden to that one asset is probably a good thing. And so, the way we like to think about it is just have a system that enables you to take as many orthogonal shots on goal as possible and know that any individual program may not have a high probability of success, but collectively, you can amortize the risk of those individual programs not working by having as many of those orthogonal shots as possible.
Yeah. Look, I've talked to a lot of drug developers, of course. I've also talked to a lot of investors, and it kind of feels like a pitch like this is potentially hard to swallow. Like, we're going to fund an amorphous, like TBD, cash generating like plan that can then therefore like fund other TBD like plans. What's underneath that and gives people the confidence to do it?
I think a big part of answering that question is really just showing the execution. And I think the earliest days, candidly, like we were incredibly hard to fundraise on. A lot of people, I went out basically saying, hey, I'm going to go try and cure this undruggable disease. And by the way, it's just me. And by the way, I'm in my bedroom in New York. And, by the way, I have no PhD. Line up. And, it was very, very hard pitch. So it took a long time. Thankfully, there were certain investors who took a big bet on me early on. It was kind of a founder bet and saw the mission alignment and that I've cared about this disease almost my whole life. And that was they were comfortable taking that bet. And I think over time, it just became a story of execution, being able to prove that like, hey, some of the key risk vectors here are execution and so on. And so then on the execution front, it became my job to, pull in some best in class drug hunters to help work on this problem. Because I think the only chance you actually have is by recruiting, the kind of the A team to work on this problem. And so that was a critical part of that story. And then, as time goes on, obviously the proof will be in the pudding. It's going to be about getting results in the clinic, and we'll endeavor to be able to show that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you've talked a little bit about assembling the Avengers of drug discovery, but if we back up, you incorporated this 2022. You're like 26 at the time, and you're going out like to these legends saying, "Do you want to try another bet here?" Like, what does that conversation look like?
Well, I think it was like it's one of these things where the more time you spend with the best people on the planet, the more you just realize they want to work on the hardest problems. I think there's a world in which like, you may a priori think that, oh, well, this is Sisyphean, right? Like, look at the graveyard of, previous attempts and like, why should we win? There's no reason for it. And, maybe you should dilute the ambitions of the company to try and recruit people. But I actually think if you're uncompromising on that actually turns out to be a good bat signal for like extremely talented people. So yeah, I mean, I think another part of that was just like lowering the activation energy to getting them involved. I just started by saying, hey, let's just catch up. I'm not looking for anything. I just want to kind of like, get to know you. And so for pretty much everyone who ultimately came on full time, it started as just like, hey, let's do catch ups like once every month or every few months, whatever, just talk science. Then it became, hey, why don't we just bring you on as a consultant, do 5 hours a day. And then it became, a conversation around, hey, I think it's time for you to, fail retirement and, come join us full time. And thankfully we've had a good track record there too.
Yeah. The slippery slope out of retirement is like a funny recruitment tactic.
The best people on the planet, just like literally, they're indefatigable. And also just, I don't know, they're just, once you get bitten by the bug, there's no going back.
They can't stop thinking about it.
Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why like, I think if you just lead with passion, lead with enthusiasm, these best in class people just they feed off of that and they reciprocate it. And it's one of the great pleasures of what I'm doing is like I get to work with people like John, Bill, the rest of the team. It's just a great honor.
Totally. Let's talk about Alzheimer's a little bit here. An incredible mission. What has everybody gotten wrong in the way that they've thought about Alzheimer's, approached Alzheimer's to date? And I'm curious if there's a point of view that you're holding today that maybe feels underrated to the world, but you think is appropriately priced on your end.
Look, I mean, I feel uncomfortable kind of saying that, implicit in my characterizing what's wrong is that I know what's right. I can't say I do. I have that. But certainly the, I think one thing that we have not yet updated our priors on is this kind of idea that there is let's call it discordance between the accumulation of some of the pathologies we think are important with the actual emergence of symptoms. And so a patient that is starting to, forget where their keys are, and, starting to have this memory loss that, is infamous with Alzheimer's, that person, on average, has had amyloid depositing in the brain for about 20 to 30 years prior. And so similarly, like the analogy I like to use is if you're going into a burning house and you're trying to put out the fire, you're not going after the match that started the fire, right? It's irrelevant at that point. You're going for the actual fire itself. And so I think similarly, we've yet as a field to kind of collectively update our priors as we think about some of these pathologies that, yes, are probably causative, but being the cause does not mean it's the best treatment vector, right? And so this is like one thing that I guess if I just like survey the landscape or kind of go to the conferences and so on, that is a burgeoning kind of, concept that we should actually consider the timeline of these pathologies. But still, I think it remains like incredibly underappreciated.
How much sooner before symptom onset do you think we should be looking?
I think it's whatever the biomarkers enable. And I think this is actually like a super interesting inflection point we're passing as the field is like, if in a world where you could predict with 100% certainty whether someone would convert to the clinical stage of Alzheimer's within 1 year, that is like incredibly tractable from a prevention standpoint, right? Because if you're actually going to run a prevention trial today, for the most part, and biomarkers are starting to help with this, but I mean, good luck running a 20 to 30 year trial, right? I mean, this is never going to happen in a million years. So I think, the way that I think real unlock for the field is going to be when you can, with an extremely high certainty, predict within a short period of time, something like 12 months, actually run that prevention trial. Because that's when, in theory, the pathology, if you intercept the right pathology, you should be able to stop those patients from converting. But similarly, if you have surrogate, biomarkers that folks believe, and specifically that FDA believes will eventually represent the conversion to MCI due to AD, then that's a tractable trial that also people will believe, and that's all you'll really need.
Are there biomarkers that you're most excited about today?
I mean, the big one that made waves in recent years was p-tau217. I think it's incredibly interesting. Some more recent stuff around EMTBR 243, and these are like, a lot of the tau related biomarkers. When you synergize them with amyloid positivity, specifically A beta 42 or 40, these are the kinds of things that give you a high AUC-RC in terms of predicting conversion to MCI. The problem is if you use them in isolation, you can do it with high certainty within like a 5 to 7 year time horizon, but you need that to shorten significantly. And so I'm very convinced the next 3 years we'll have big breakthroughs there, and we're already seeing kind of early precursors to this. But then there's a separate problem, which is if you're trying to predict the conversion to MCI in sporadic Alzheimer's patients, like part of the reason people have gone to familial Alzheimer's is that it's a high certainty of conversion, and so when they should develop it. And so any exceptions to that conversion become very interesting. But yeah, on the other hand, with some of these biomarkers, you just really need to do kind of like weight matrix of different factors, figure out what the conversion is, and then beyond that, understand that there's still a prevalence problem, because maybe only 5% of the patients that you're actually tracking will convert. Maybe you have 100% certainty for that 5%. But if it's only 5%, again, there's like a kind of a sample size problem that you're dealing with. And so, these aren't solved problems, but I'm actually I think the trend lines in terms of biomarkers and so on, where the field's going is trending incredibly favorably.
Yeah. I mean, this reminds me of, we've done some multiple sclerosis work where what you're tracking is relapses. And currently, like in MS, there's some pretty good DMTs that take, I think the average patient has a relapse every 8 years or something like this, which means in order to have like a stat sig like improvement in lengthening the time between relapses, you're tracking for quite a long time, and you have to have quite a large sample size in order to have anything that looks like remotely statistically relevant.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think this is like one of the, this is the horrible and tragic reality of Alzheimer's, but also on the other side, serves as an interesting scientific benchmark. Is like the decline for Alzheimer's is inexorable, right? So the room for a placebo effect is relatively, like, the ceiling is very low. And so, at the limit, the probability of a false positive is essentially zero. If you're giving a drug, it's either going after 2 years. If the patient is stable, that is like almost, if multiple endpoints are showing stability multiple years out, that to me is like, that's the holy grail. And so I guess I would also say scientifically, I'm atypically comfortable with very small sample sizes in terms of if there is an effect on multiple endpoints that are suggesting stabilization, even if it's a small subset of patients, I believe those data after a certain period of time, because again, you can't placebo your way out of having Alzheimer's. And so I think maybe this remains also underappreciated, is that some of these trajectories, they're not going to be reliable, but we are starting to triangulate trajectories with biomarkers. And I feel pretty convinced that anyway, there's probably more work to be done there, but you can stratify patients accordingly.
Yeah. So your stated North Star, let's solve Alzheimer's. The kind of stated plan is we're going to be a drug development company, but it sounds like the real bottleneck is having something predictive enough first, to go after before developing any drugs in the first place. So, am I maybe previewing a little bit into the plan here, or am I off base?
I mean, look, of course, the perfect world is one in which you can kind of predict prior to running the trial what's going to work. I think that remains a pipe dream. But I'd be remiss not to comment on the fact that I do think AI is going to be, some non-trivial percentage helpful there. And so a part of that is just on the ideation phase. Like we've found internally, some of the internal tools we've built, like we have an internal kind of co-scientist, let's just call it, or co-pilot, that has been incredibly helpful for the team as they chase the idea maze on a bunch of different, ideas. It can definitely help collapse the kind of iteration loop for ideation. I think, the kind of the example that we had was the fine-tuned model with OpenAI. So, we spent 6 months with the OpenAI research team developing a model to do basically only one thing, which was predict clinical trial outcomes, and specifically predict whether the primary endpoint would be statistically significant. It turns out that you can stitch together these clues and pretty reliably predict clinical trial outcomes. Now, does that mean it's better than the best CMOs in the world? No, I don't think so. I just think it means it kind of adds a scaling factor to their expertise and allows you to actually make predictions in a much more high throughput way, and serves as a nice existence proof that like fine-tuned AI can clearly do something. And so, that's maybe another thing that I think is like potentially mispriced currently is just this idea that AI can be fine-tuned to be hyper-specialized and good at specific tasks. And maybe folks aren't appreciating that enough as well.
This idea of predicting clinical trial outcomes is fascinating. I guess specifically what you think there's predictive power for.
I mean, look, I think, where these models perform extremely well is in trying to determine, well, basically just like with all AI, anything that's within distribution. So if you're trying to determine the probability of something being best in class, that's where at least we're seeing, incredible performance with these models. In terms of things that are like out of distribution, like first in class medicines, what have you, the predictiveness falls off. And so, that begs an interesting question of like, what can we actually do to enable these models to then start underwriting things it hasn't seen before? That's an unanswered question. I mean, I'm definitely of the belief that human experts helping kind of tweak these models is a very good way of tackling that problem. But yeah, I mean, the concept is relatively straightforward, right? If you could spend 100,000 hours and had perfect recall, and you could go and read as many papers as you'd like within that time, I'm pretty sure if you, with enough time and enough iterations, you'd be able to figure out what's predictive of whether a trial will hit the primary endpoint or not. And so, yeah, this is kind of the basic concept there in terms of these models, right? They're just stitching together clues from previous trials, from information out there on the internet, as well as proprietary databases in some cases, and making predictions accordingly.
And is this all just like MOA believability? Is this like also incorporating trial design execution? Like what kind of goes into that?
It's all the above. So, and the beauty of it is it actually determines quantitatively how it should properly weight those different factors, right? And so at the end of the day, like, there's a lot of cases. So the model we built with OpenAI spit out a justification with each trial prediction. And so when we make a prediction there, it's not just giving us a probability of success for any given trial, but it's also giving us a full justification that can then be underwritten by, our team of best-in-class drug hunters or whomever. And that interpretability layer was very important from a design perspective, because it allowed us to say, okay, well, what is the model using to underwrite this probability? And individuals can come in and scrutinize that justification accordingly. But yeah, we see in the justifications, like sometimes it would say that, well, the biology is conceivably actually, that targeting this biology would actually work on paper. But when I actually do the calculations on the PK/PD, we actually think we're going to get insufficient exposure to actually get the therapeutic effect. And it'll fail for that reason. And so we'd see like it would converge on the same decisions from completely different justifications. And that on its own is an incredibly kind of scintillating prospect, at least for me.
Yeah, fascinating. This feels like the kind of thing that, if true, is a no-brainer. What do you think is like stopping everyone from just doing this right now?
I mean, a huge part of it is proprietary data and also know-how. And I think, the bigger question is like the trend line is just clearly that these models are getting better, and that the bar in terms of what it requires to make the models even better is going up and up and up. And so I think as we kind of like shift rightward on the distribution in terms of what expertise is required to improve these models, like from an evals perspective and beyond, yeah, I mean, it kind of begs the question of like, at what point will fine tuning no longer be enough, and at what point will there not be enough data to be able to fine tune these models further?
Let me ask, like, what data did you have to run this like fine tuning up? Because if I'm guessing how you did it, you can tell me if I'm guessing wrong. If I'm guessing how you did it, you went through clinicaltrials.gov, you scraped out what the eligibility criteria, and that's like kind of there, but not exactly like the eligibility criteria for the study. And then you looked at whether each of the kind of studies like passed, failed, because that's all public record. Is that more or less right?
So it started with the licensing of a data set from a third party that had spent years fastidiously tracking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trials and putting in, I mean, the dimensionality of the data we haven't reported, but there was a lot of parameters that went into that, including the trial design, including a bunch of other things. And so all of that got integrated. Yeah, since then, it's been a story of just tracking accordingly, right? You track prospective trials. Once you collect those data, you kind of recursively feed those back into the models, and hopefully, if everything goes right, you see a trend line that still remains positive as it sees more and more data.
I'm dying to that. Like, did you see a difference between the like easy publicly available way I just described and the proprietary data set that you described? I'm curious like what the difference looked like.
I probably shouldn't go too much into those details.
Sure.
What I can say is obviously the ability of the models to make good predictions is directly proportional to the amount of data you put in. And so, there's proprietary data around specific trials definitely help. And so for our internal programs, it has access to full proprietary data that we have. And for the most part, you're relatively constrained in terms of the predictions you can make for, for instance, for the trials that we made with the fine-tuned model with OpenAI and the data that we had announced, this was very specifically only in publicly traded companies. And part of the basis of that was that they actually had a lot of, first of all, they were forced to report the results in most cases. And then secondly, a lot of those came with previously reported clinical data that were in previous investor presentations or what have you. And so we had
posters, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it provided a repository of data that allowed the model to pull from, that enabled the model to basically pull from these different sources. And again, like if the kind of success of the model is directly proportional to the amount of data it sees, okay, naturally, you'd want to kind of give it as much data as possible. And that's where, the proprietary data element also becomes a relevant factor.
So then playing this forward, like every top 10, top 20 pharma company builds this for themselves, and then IQVIA builds it and sells it to all the biotechs. Is that the natural end state of this market?
Sure. I think on a timeline that I'm not sure I can predict, there will definitely be the commoditization of all these models, right? And so I think, an important question for a lot of the players in the space to be asking is how can we kind of lean into whatever your edge is? Because the opportunity to have an edge, I think, is collapsing exponentially. And so, a bet we're taking is obviously that you can take tailwind expertise and use those to be able to fine tune these models. And if you have best in class people as your evals for these models, then that's probably better than having an army of people who are good but not the best. But yeah, at the end of the day, people are going to have to start playing strategies because that window is definitely closing, in my opinion. And it'll be really interesting to see how it all plays out.
Well, the funny thing I think about the collapse of your edge is that it follows the iteration cycles of like an industry, right? Because eventually, these things get competed away through iterations. And that's every industry, every market has like a natural physics of like how fast like the iterations go. And it just so happens that like this market,
the longest and most expensive you can possibly have. Yeah.
You might have an edge for decades. If you're very hush about it, which is why you're not telling me what you're doing.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's that's like one version of the story. I think the other is to properly validate, especially on things that there's kind of two mechanisms or two ways to interpret that. One is the one you just mentioned. I think the other is that it takes a very long time to prove out whether your strategy works, right? And so to whatever extent you can come up with clever ways to kind of, near term validate your method, which we tried to do, by the way, by just by basically just training the model to make predictions on trials that were being read out right? So prospectively, so we didn't need to only focus on our pipeline. We could focus on the totality of all trials that that were getting read out,
All right,
and
I'm
be able to
gonna read
benchmark.
you a list of pending phase 3s, and you tell me what you think. All right, and then we're gonna go.
You wouldn't be the only person asking me for those. I'll tell you that.
Look, I can't invest on in the market. I've got too much
Yeah.
too much proprietary info.
That's hilarious.
This is fascinating. You've got a model that allows you to at least start to predict trial outcomes. Where are you most skeptical of the way that it kind of runs?
I think again, like the thing that I'm like maybe most skeptical or concerned about is what happens when presented with something that's out of distribution.
Best in
And
class, first in class.
yeah, like if this is a first in class medicine, how does the performance actually fare? And so, I think the best thing you can do to kind of get to that point is to try and extract the heuristics of how a best in class scientist or drug hunter would underwrite this. And to whatever extent you can extract those heuristics, try and bake those into the model, right? Like the way John on our team thinks about things is incredibly idiosyncratic, right? Like there is just a certain kind of way of thinking that comes from being in the game for 40 years and having consistent successes. Like inventing 4 FDA approved drugs is just like, that is a non-trivial feat. And so like that is definitionally out of distribution to begin with. And so having someone like that, give feedback on these models and actually integrate their ways of thinking into these models, I think is the only way you can tackle that problem of like, how do we then make a prediction on something the model has never seen anything like it before? So yeah.
So let me back up. Is a day in the life or like a week in the life over at Babylon like the AI gods come down and they say like these things look great, and then you've got like the legends kind of like looking at it going like, this is probably wrong for these reasons, or this is like probably worth trying.
I wouldn't say it's just like it's clean as that, right? I mean, these are, at the end of the day, all these things are tools in the armamentarium, right? And so the way I see this is like, to whatever extent you can expand your arsenal, you should do so. And so we employ different tools accordingly, right? Like certain situations require a little more, heavy lifting on the AI front than others. And others, we kind of depend very heavily on specifically only the expertise of our best-in-class team, because an AI would not be able to even underwrite that program. So yeah, I'd say it's just like assembling an armamentarium and then deploying those different tools accordingly. Yes, it's a week in the life of Babylon is some approximation of what you characterized for sure.
I mean, that sounds like a ton of fun. I can see why people want to do it. I mean, like even just kind of abstract this out to what we're seeing with kind of software development and engineering. It's able to kind of take care of a lot of the grunt work that was nobody's favorite part of the jobs anyways, and they get to focus on a lot of the thinking and like the hard stuff, which at least the best people in the world love to do.
Definitely. Yeah. By the way, I think that's like, I think there is the long tail. So there's the sexy use cases that everyone wants to be like the AI use case for drug discovery and development. I think there's the long tail of minutia that are less sexy, but actually like probably the most impactful on the day to day. And so, I think that's another thing for people building at this nexus, like to be thinking about is there's the kind of like headline grabbing things like, honestly, the fine-tuned model to make clinical trial predictions. That is one of them. And then there's the day-to-day or like, regulatory submissions or, there's a litany of different things that we have to do in the kind of discovery and development process that should be automated. And LLMs have enabled a lot of the kind of automation of this for the first time, but maybe because they're not sexy enough, people aren't pursuing them. I don't know.
I'd love to just riff with you a little bit. I feel like I hear a lot about AI in drug discovery. You're kind of choosing a stance of like AI in like screening. Not screening?
AI for screening molecules, but not high throughput screening, for instance. Like I'm more skeptical there. Yeah.
Okay. Talk to me. Like talk to me about like the value chain of like the discovery world, and like where you think it's got a great leverage, or where you think it's maybe overhyped.
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things about this kind of like where to apply AI is a lot of folks are focusing on the discovery stage, and that there's clearly some level of enablement there. But I think, my concern is that, I mean, the supermajority of spend in the entire process of getting a drug to market is in the later stages. And so if the costs are going up exponentially as a function of time and progress, it makes more sense, in my opinion, to be focusing on that side of the distribution than the earliest stage where the timelines are shorter relatively and the overall cost is much lower. For me, it makes more sense to be, trying to deploy these systems. Like you talk about leverage. I think the leverage is like also, the leverage and impact is directly proportional to the cost of that phase. And so we should be focusing more on the tail end of that process instead of the earliest stages. And I think another part of that is also like what kind of data are available, right? I mean, for a lot of like small molecule chemistry side of things, the majority of information around medicinal chemistry comes from the stuff that doesn't work, not the stuff that does. And so if you're only if you're training a model on all published literature, for instance, or kind of FDA approved drugs or whatever, that's the tip of the iceberg. And so to be sampling only from the right tail of the distribution, that feels like the wrong way to tackle that problem, when actually the majority of the information is in the kind of massive like the long tail of other stuff that didn't work along the way. Basically, part of the reason that I think, at least we've decided not to take a bet on the kind of like AI chemistry nexus is that, you learn from the med chemists pretty early on that the supermajority of information is coming from the stuff that doesn't work, not the stuff that does. And so these activity cliffs are basically, you find a molecule where you start to see some improvement on some vector, and you have to contextualize that with the long tail of other molecules that were designed or screened that didn't actually work. And my fear is that like a lot of these AIs that are just trained on publicly available information or FDA-approved drugs, they're overly sanguine by default because they're only taking stuff that was on the right side of that distribution. The majority of the information is in the 99% of stuff that didn't work, not the 1% that did. And so, I think just like, unless you are unless you own that part of the value chain where you're actually screening the molecules and you have decades of information there, CDD Vault is a kind of an interesting one, although all those data are proprietary, so they won't be able to capture it. But I do think a lot of these folks that are playing at that layer and have actually run the screens over the past several decades, if they have stored those data, that is incredibly valuable. But I think absent that, it's an incredibly hard problem to solve, and also probably doesn't generalize across targets, right? You may have an incredibly potent inhibitor of one kinase, but it's not going to generalize to others because chemical space is incredibly jagged and just very hard to do.
Totally. Okay, so you in the kind of like conversation before the recording, you're telling me a little bit about like thinking about giving the best drug developers in the world AI superpowers. What specifically are you talking about when you think of AI superpowers for them?
I mean, I think part of it is honestly just giving them like, for a lot of these drug hunters, they're used to doing drug discovery in a way that is like, they've been doing drug discovery in the same way, more or less, for about 40 years, right? And so the way I think about this is like, how do you lower the friction to using a technology that they've never integrated before into their process? And part of it is showing them the value in a very near term. And so I think where we're seeing a lot of wins on that front is like, they are chasing a new idea, and an AI can be very good at surfacing the relevant literature. Like that's the lowest pole. That's the lowest kind of tier of the totem pole, and we're seeing a lot of wins there where it's just pulling more relevant information than you'd find on Google or Google Scholar or whatever.
Maybe last kind of question for you then here is, have you seen this AI prediction market for clinical trials that seems to be trending on Twitter?
Yes, I have. Definitely.
What do you think? You must be looking at that going, man, like. You've either got it all wrong or you've got it all right. What's your take?
Here's what I can say. Predicting the trial outcome is not the same as predicting the price action of the stock after the readout. And so I think
we've seen that.
We've seen that, time and time again. And I think especially as it relates to the statistics of the primary endpoint versus the effect size. And so we've actually done these kind of post hoc analyses because people have asked us this question in the past as well. And the long story short is predicting the price action of like a lot of these publicly traded biotechs is like, it's so uncorrelated with the actual outcome of the trial. And a lot of times it has to do with the run up prior to the readout. Maybe over the past year, the stock's up, 70% for whatever reason. And so the room for it to go thereafter is pretty low. Maybe sometimes you hit the primary endpoint, but the effect size was not good enough. Like think about a lot of the GLP-1s where you may actually have stat sig weight loss, but the actual effect size of the weight loss is less than whatever the best in class drug is at the time. And therefore the stock goes, trades below cash. So yes, it's definitely like, especially with the retail investors, is picking up so much steam. And I'm actually like glad people are, paying more attention to this. But yeah, the correlation is like a lot lower than you'd think between the primary endpoint, or at least even the effect size, honestly, and the actual outcome on the price action.
Yeah, there seems to be two parts to the story. The first one is like how do you feel about the tradability of the information and like the encouragement of like more like exuberant retail and biotech, which is like admittedly like a tough space to be in, to be a retail investor in. And the second one is the potential ethical implications on like actual trial operations and like the way that we try to like maintain neutrality. Like this is the work we do. Like I know that sponsors would be squeamish about the idea that like patients could go look up and like a study and have some outside in perspective on whether it's likely to work or not, and does that impact kind of expectancy bias and like placebo response and like all these different like components. I could just imagine all the legal cruft that's going to come from this.
That is an incredibly good point. That's actually an incredibly interesting thread. I mean, I think very cool, Brandon. I'm this is like going off script, but yeah, no, I'm just like, that's really interesting. I've not considered that implication in terms of expectancy bias and how, for sure. And also like from a recruitment perspective, right? Like is it fair, like in a world where you have a system that is like not, 100% accurate? I mean, at the end of the day, like people's enrollment in trials is not like per se driven by their expectation around the success of that drug. I think most people enrolling in a trial see that there is a drug for whatever, for whatever disease or indication they're, suffering from. And that is sufficient for them to want to enroll. I think when you stack on this layer around some external prediction on the outcome of the trial, there are ethical implications for sure on that. And I think at the end of the day, the only solution to that is information suppression, which I'm not in favor of. And so I think it presents a really interesting dilemma that like probably is unavoidable, candidly, but it is, I mean, like imagine, especially in a world where you have a false negative, I think the implications are really severe. Like if you were to have a cancer treatment that an AI model predicts is going to fail, and in a world where that was wrong and it was an actual false positive, that false negative, that has profound implications in terms of its effect on society. So that's a really interesting point, and I'm well received.
Dude, genie's out of the bottle though. So we'll see how this thing plays out.
Totally.
No stopping that once you've made it available. Well, Sacha, hey, this has been such a fun conversation. I really appreciate you coming on board, shooting the shit, maybe sharing a little bit more than maybe typically sharing online. But I've so enjoyed this conversation. So thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much. This was super fun.
Yeah, of course.